ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Just reminding you that if you are just joining us for the first time, then you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. You can access the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page you'll find the chat room, you'll find the archived versions of this show, and you'll find the RSS feed, the links to my more recent articles as they're posted on BrandonTurbeville.com. Now, I'd like to remind you also that you can catch my articles as they come out at ActivistPost.com. You can catch those articles by going to Activist Post and clicking on the Contributors tab and finding my name under Staff Writers and clicking on my name, and that will take you to the Activist Post archive page. You can also find my articles occasionally on the antimedia.org and on progressivegazette.com. If you're interested in my work specifically, then I would encourage you to go to BrandonTurbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the archive versions of this show, and all of the YouTube videos, all of the interviews that I do, and so forth, all of the other relevant information. Of course, there's a link to my books there as well at the top of the page, and other relevant information about the radio show. So we have several things to discuss tonight, and we're going to try to cover them all. Got the domestic situation, of course, as well as the situation in Syria, in Ukraine, in Turkey, in Egypt. We've got a whole list of foreign affairs issues to deal with, also in Taiwan, that we'll try to get to as well. Now, in terms of the domestic situation, I want to mention first, because this is news, probably not the bigger picture essentially, but the activist Scott Olson. Those of you who recognize that name will remember that Scott Olson was a protester with Occupy America. It was Occupy Oakland, California. And Scott Olson was the protester, the Iraq war veteran who was shot in the head by police and beanbag rounds. Scott Olson was rushed to the hospital. He was in critical condition, and he actually lost the ability to speak, to perform basic motor functions, and concentrate adequately. Now, that happened last year, and currently Scott Olson is able to speak. His speech is still slurred, and his memory and concentration are still impaired, but he's been able to recover some of his critical faculties. The city of Oakland was forced to pay out $4.5 million to Olson in a settlement, but the news, and I've done an article up there at Activist Post about this, is that the Oakland Police Department has now promoted two of the police officers involved in the shooting. Paul Figueroa, has been promoted to the position of assistant police chief. So he's now the second in command of the Oakland Police Department. And Officer Roland Holmgren, who is a sergeant with Tango Team, or one of the Tango teams, the Oakland Police. The Tango Team is a tactical squad consisting of 5 officers and 1 sergeant per squad. This Holmgren was involved in the Olson shooting as well, but like Figueroa, he was recently promoted. He's just been awarded the title of lieutenant here in 2014. So the article is entitled "Promotion Given to Cops Who Shot Occupy Activist Scott Olson." And let me just go through part of an article here. It was written by Ollie Winston of East Bay Press. It says, at the time of the shooting, Figueroa had no business being the incident commander or accepting the position. He was the head of the department's internal affairs division. As such, he would be responsible for investigating any misconduct stemming from that incident. It was a clear conflict of interest. As it turned out, OPD botched both the administrative and criminal investigations into the Olson shooting. To this day, the department has yet to identify the officer responsible. Well, this was not a botched attempt at an investigation. This, of course, was a cover-up from the beginning. The Oakland Police Department was supposed to investigate itself, and then the pitiful, just smokescreen cover-up agency of Internal Affairs was also supposed to investigate it as well. Of course, they did nothing of the sort. Interim Police Chief Sean Went, who had himself been head of the department's internal affairs division, which that just speaks volumes again as to the worth and credibility of that agency. He went forward with the promotions for Figueroa and Holmgren. Now, it's interesting also to point out that East Bay Press reports that Holmgren has quite the history of violence. This is the gentleman that was the sergeant of the tactical squad, the Tango team. Holmgren had been involved in the illegal use of force against anti-war protesters at the Port of Oakland in 2003. In 2010, he was involved in a drunken brawl with prison guards at a charity boxing event. And in 2012, he was disciplined for turning off his chest-mounted camera during clashes with Occupy Oakland demonstrators. So this is the guy who was involved or in charge of one of the Tango teams that shot Scott Olson. Now, although the Oakland Police Department was conveniently unable to determine who the actual officer was who was responsible for the shooting of Olson, East Bay Press was able to discover who did it. Right, this is funny. The Internal Affairs Department and the Oakland Police Department was unable to determine who it was that shot Olson, but the East Bay Press managed to figure it out. Ollie Winston, who wrote the article about Scott Olson, who broke the story, was actually able to identify the shooter, and it was Officer Robert Roche. That's Robert R-O-C-H-E, Roche, is the actual shooter. Now, Roche was fired, but the Alameda County District Attorney never filed charges against him. So he was fired. That's all that happened, was he lost his job. And they didn't file any charges against Holmgren and Figueroa either. In fact, as I just mentioned, they were promoted. So this goes to show you the true nature of the police departments in the United States and the true reason for these police departments becoming more militaristic and the changes in hiring practices and so forth for the police departments across the world. Of course, Americans have been brainwashed for years. Of course, they've always been brainwashed into supporting their law enforcement, right or wrong. And that's done by constant repetition of stupid, childish propaganda like heroes. Right, that these guys, because some buildings fell in New York, automatically these police are somehow heroes, no matter how much they act like animals, no matter how many times they kill American citizens. In fact, they are responsible now for more dead American citizens than the Iraqi insurgency. So, who is the real danger here? Is it terrorists? Is it terrorism? Is it an enemy somewhere in Iraq or in a foreign country, or is it the armed gangs of police, or what we call police in the United States? Right? I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago when I talked about the situation in York County, when the York County Sheriff's Department fired upon an elderly man who was reaching for a cane because the idiot cop thought he had a gun. And if the police are justified in just opening fire with deadly force, numerous rounds, simply because they had reason to believe that they were in danger, even if that person is unarmed, they have reason to believe that they're in danger, and that justifies their use of force. Does that mean then that the American people are justified in open season on police simply because they feel that their lives are in danger? Because they have every reason to believe that their lives are in danger. I mean, their lives, more American citizens have died as a result of police killings than were killed by the Iraqi insurgency. Let that sink in for a minute. So why wouldn't the American people see the police as the enemy? They'd have every right to, and going by the police logic, it would be open season on police. So, but there's no doubt that their logic won't be applied to the, or won't be allowed to be used by the American people as it is by the police departments, because the police departments are not there, obviously, to protect you or to respond to your emergencies. They're there to keep order whenever things begin to collapse. They're there to impose a police state on the rest of us. They are gearing up for war, as we've seen. They've got the MRAP vehicles, the mine-resistant armored personnel carriers. They've got the jackboots. They've got the machine guns. They've got the Hitler helmets, the military uniforms, the bulletproof vests, the grenades, you name it, the surveillance drones. They are gearing up for war. This is what militaries do. So the question only is then, who are they gearing up for war against? And clearly, well, we know the answer to that. You don't send police off to foreign countries. The enemy is the American people. And, of course, I would imagine that most of the listeners to this show are well aware of that, but this is just one more example of how this type of thing actually works. Now, on to Syria. There's been some developments in Syria as of late. There have been a series. I guess we should start with the good news, because this is something to be happy about. The recent announcement by Jabhat al-Nusra, what some commenters and analysts are saying is a handover of old Homs to the Syrian Arab army, which, looking at the documents and the translations, does seem to be rather tepid. It's not a surrender, but a handover of old Homs to the Syrian Arab army. Homs is, of course, a very large city in Syria. It's in between Damascus and Aleppo. It's on the Aleppo highway. It's a very strategic region, but perhaps just as important here is the announcement that the official announcement, and we've known this for some time, that Yabrud in the Kalamun region of Syria had been freed of the death squads, but now it's the official announcement had not come yet. I guess mainly because the Syrian army did not want to announce a successful liberation until every single area and rat hole of the death squads had been cleared out of their miserable existence. However, in the last 8 hours, we have received official reports by the Syrian army that the Kalamun region in its entirety is free of death squads. So the word is that the number of death squad killers that have themselves been killed in Kalamun will top 250. So there is a finite number to the amount of death squad agents that can be used. Of course, they're churning them out as much as they can in Libya and Saudi Arabia for the benefit of the I guess you would say the world oligarchy. But there is a finite number nonetheless. And so this is good news. This is good news that Kalamun is now free. These soldiers, thousands of soldiers, of Syrian soldiers, will be able to now move on to new areas. There is, however, some bad news, and that is, of course, what I reported on last week. And there's an article entitled "Turkey Plans False Flag Against Syria, Blocks YouTube, Twitter." Now, it's well known that even though with the victories of the Syrian army that the world oligarchy is not going to stop simply because Assad has made gains. What is also concerning is that there are so many plans still still yet so many plans to conduct false flag operations to justify the invasion of Syria by either the United States or by some other foreign power. In this case, we have Turkey. Turkey steps up to the plate. And what we have is, and I should remind the listeners that this show is being recorded on April 9th, so again, things can change on the ground rather quickly. But we have yet another intercepted phone call. It's the audio of Turkish intelligence chief Hakan Fidan, Foreign Minister Ahmet Davutoglu, and Deputy Chief of Military Staff Yasser Güler, as well as some other top Turkish officials discussing a possible attack on Syria. Now, this attack would have been predicated publicly on the basis of securing the tomb of Suleiman Shah, who was the grandfather of the founder of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Turkey regards the tomb as sovereign Turkish territory because they signed a treaty with France in 1921 in this regard, and Syria in 1921 was under French rule. About 24 Turkish Special Forces soldiers permanently guard the tomb, but the tomb is in Syria. So it's Syrian territory by all common sense and sanity. This is Syrian land, Syrian territory. But because it contains the tomb of Suleiman Shah, and because Turkey signed an agreement with France in 1921, Turkey claims that this land belongs to Turkey. This just doesn't make any legitimate sense here, but there it is. So, as a result of this phone call being released, or this audio tape being released, Turkey has moved to block YouTube and they described the recording as villainous and a wretched attack on national security. But what this does is simply just lend credence to the recordings, which I think have been pretty well confirmed by this point. So, about 2 weeks ago, Turkey publicly threatened, or I guess about 3 weeks ago now, had publicly threatened to respond to any attack on the tomb after there was a confrontation between death squads like ISIL and other related rebel groups. That's ISIL is Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, but they have been fighting with ISIS, Nusra, FSA, you name it. These are fractured death squad groups. They're no longer held together. Only in ideology are they similar, and that's all that really counts. They're different fighting groups that war against each other on a regular basis, but they're fractured. Yeah, they're fractured, but in their ideology they are the same. They're all funded by the West. They're all funded by Saudi Arabia, trained, directed, armed by the West. So there is no point in making distinctions as to who these death squads are. You can name the names of the different organizations, but there is no difference. In fact, you can go to the New York Times and read an article that's entitled "There Are No Moderates in Syria." Actually, that's an article by Tony Carlucci. But there's an article in the New York Times, if you Google that as well, where the author points out that he's seen many rebels in Syria, but not one of them that could be classified as moderate. And in this day and age, with the Western media propaganda, you can look at the death squads and consider the moderates to be moderate cannibals. Maybe the moderate cannibals cook the heads before they eat them. The more extreme rebels simply eat the heads raw. The heads, of course, that they cut off of innocent people and Syrian military soldiers. Numerous video evidence of this. Just go to YouTube, or probably LiveLeak, since LiveLeak tries not to censor real life. You can see the death squads enjoying their dinner, courtesy and paid for by the United States and the West and the taxpayers. As you all go down the drain, you know that you can fund this kind of savagery in Syria. And maybe I can comment a little more on that, but let's go back to talk about Turkey here and finish this up. Turkey had threatened to respond to any attack on the tomb because it considers it Turkish national territory. If that confrontation had become even more hot between the ISIL and other rebel groups in the area, or the death squad groups in the area. This is nothing but an excuse, a rather weak excuse, to engage in military incursion into Syria. This is simply for Western consumption and Turkish public consumption, but it's likely that the West will buy it, but it's not likely that the Turkish population will necessarily buy it. Now, and what they had planned to do, in addition to planning to respond to this attack on the tomb, because the Western media is only reporting this as a discussion between Davutoglu and his comrades about responding to the attack on the tomb. Well, what this actually is there was also a discussion of engaging in a false flag attack against the tomb to justify the engagement. So this is entirely ironic, because Turkey itself has been responsible for the facilitation, the direction, the organization of many of these death squads operating in Syria. So their border itself has been so wide open to the death squads. It's just, you might as well put a death squad crossing sign to warn the other travelers. This is a wide open border. It resembles the U.S.-Mexico border. So if you listen to the audio recording, you will hear Foreign Ministry Undersecretary Feridun Sinirlioglu. This is what he states. This is what the Undersecretary states. An operation against ISIL has international legitimacy. We will define it as Al-Qaeda. There are no issues on the Al-Qaeda framework. When it comes to the Suleiman Shah tomb, it's about the protection of national soil. So, end quote. Reportedly, the voice of intelligence chief Hakan Fidan responds, quote, justification can be created. The matter is to create the will, end quote. Now, TIB, which is the Turkish Telecom Authority, has responded, or they did respond to this situation by taking what they call an administrative measure against YouTube, and they blocked the website in Turkey. And this came after a week after Turkey had blocked access to Twitter for the same reasons. Now, according to Reuters, there was a source in Erdogan's office that said the video sharing service YouTube was blocked as a precaution after the voice recordings created a national security issue, and said it may lift the ban if YouTube agreed to remove the content. Well, if the recordings are real, then Turkey has clearly attempted a false flag attack in order to justify the invasion of Syria. Are you mad, Erdogan? Would be a good question. Do you really want to destabilize your own country? You're teetering on the edge. Do you really want to push the Turkish nation to war with Syria? This is not a good endeavor for Turkey, not only because the population would largely be split in several different directions. Also, it would likely cause the Kurds, once Turkey is thrown into some level of discord, it would likely throw the Kurds or prompt them to take a stronger stand in terms of their own independence and setting up their own independent Kurdistan. Now, March 24th, it's important also to remember Turkey shot down a Syrian fighter jet, which it claims violated its airspace. Now, the Syrian officials claim that it was Turkey that violated the Syrian airspace in an attempt to interfere with Syrian operations against the death squads near Latakia. It is notable that the Syrian jet actually crashed on Syrian territory, not Turkish land. So that's also that points to the fact that this is more likely than not a violation of Syrian airspace by Turkey. And the operations that were taking place were air raids against death squads. So Turkey is now acting as Al-Qaeda's air force. So it's important to remember as well. It's also important to remember that Turkey fired a number of artillery and tank shells against the Syrian military positions recently as well. So this all took place, the downing of the Syrian jet, the shelling with the tanks and the artillery, all took place as a major offensive of death squad agents who were pushing across the Turkey-Syria border took place as well. So essentially this was a conduit This was a conduit mission. It was a push to get the death squads, more death squads into Syria, even as Syria is starting to clamp down on the movement of these death squads. So this was clearly an invasion, an invasion operation by the Turkish authorities and the Turkish government. So one more quote here I want to read. Mimi al-Alaham, which you might know also as Syrian Girl, wrote an article which was posted on Tony Carlucci's website, Land Destroyer Report, where she writes, quote, "The al-Qaeda attack and takeover of the Kasab border crossing has caused up to 2,000 to 6,000 Armenian Syrians to flee the area. Mass looting and destruction of religious sites was reported by residents, similar to criminal acts carried out in the recently liberated city of Yabrud. Armenians are once again refugees due to the Turkish government, like their ancestors who fled the Armenian Holocaust decades ago. There's been no mention on the BBC of NATO's open support for al-Qaeda groups. The attack comes in the backdrop of mass rallies against Turkish President Erdogan, who recently banned Twitter. The battles in Latakia are ongoing, with the Syrian military inflicting heavy losses on al-Qaeda militants." Now, what she's talking about here when she mentions the Armenian Holocaust, decades ago there was, well, it's been more than just a few decades, but there were hundreds of thousands of Armenians who were slaughtered by the Turkish government. Now, the village of Kasab, which was taken over as a result of this push of death squads coming over from Turkey, resulted in the not only looting and destruction of religious sites, but the killing of Armenians, the displacement of Armenians. So Armenians, once again, because of the actions of the stupid Turkish government, have been driven out of their land. They've been made homeless. They've been killed as a result of that. So I guess the United States, Britain, France, and the rest of the world oligarchy can check their name on the list, as well as the people who have supported this attack on the Syrian Armenians. But we're going to talk a little bit more on the foreign policy side of things on the other side. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. Stay with us.
Protests condemning the police use of force were held around the country. The incident galvanized the Occupy movement in Oakland. Within a week, a general strike temporarily shut down the Oakland ports. Scott Olson was later released from the hospital and sued the Oakland Police Department. Today, he's joining us from Berkeley to announce a settlement in his case. Scott Olson, a member of Iraq Veterans Against the War, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about the lawsuit and the settlement that you have now reached?
Yes. We earlier in this week we reached a settlement with the city of Oakland, and you know, it was a long process. It took 2.5 years almost to get to this point, and we're going to announce further details at a press conference later in the morning in Oakland. But I'm happy with the way this lawsuit has turned out. It has been a very stressful experience, having to deal with it. So for that reason alone, I'm happy that it's over.
Now, Scott, you had originally said when you filed the lawsuit that you were intent on bringing it to trial because you wanted to have the facts come out. Your decision to agree to a settlement and why you felt it was best to do it at this point?
Well, going to trial would have meant even more stress, and it would have taken a lot more time. It could have taken an extra year or two. And, you know, that's kind of just a reality I had to deal with. And, yeah, part of me does wish we had gone to trial, but this is what's going to work out for me better, I think, and hopefully for pushing forward for change in Oakland police policy.
Scott, I know in your news conference you're going to announce more details, but can you share with us what the settlement is with the Oakland police?
No, we're saving the amounts of the settlement for our press conference. But whatever the amount is, it's certainly not enough to make up for a part of my brain that is dead and will forever be dead. But it will hopefully, or it will be enough for me to make it easier to get by from day to day, especially since I'm looking at having more likely to have further medical problems down the road in 20, 30 or more years.
And Scott, you're the last of several people who sued the Oakland police as a result of police abuse during that period of time. Do you get a sense that there's a real a determination to change policies by the Oakland officials?
Well, I think that having these lawsuits could be enough to bring some accountability to the police. And as far as I know, I'm the last outstanding case from Occupy with police brutality in Oakland. It's important that they need to know that if they use these weapons, the beanbags and the CS flashbangs, and they use them against a crowd control policy that they have already agreed to, and they blatantly violate that, then they shouldn't be allowed to use these weapons at all if they can't play by the rules that they've been given.
Scott, what is the extent of the injury to your brain, and how will it impact you in the future?
There's a portion of my left frontal lobe which is dead, and that manifests itself in different cognitive problems, fatigue, memory, planning, and things like this. It made it very difficult when I tried to return to employment, and it makes that unrealistic for me. I'm at a much greater risk of down the line developing dementia, Alzheimer's, or other cognitive issues. And
is there any deal you've made with the police around their behavior and changes and how they deal with people in protest?
No deal has been made, but we are going to put pressure on or work with the police for, our first step is to disallow the use of the weapons that they attacked me with. The beanbags and the flashbangs were both key in what happened to me. They use the flashbangs, and they are designed to cause panic. They are designed to cause people to scatter. Now, you can't safely fire beanbags into a crowd after you deploy those flashbangs. You can't hit the target because people are going to be running.
And do you know what you were hit by?
I was hit with a beanbag round, which is fired out of a shotgun, and it's like a nylon sock with 40 grams of lead pellets. And it was from about a distance of about 15 feet.
Well, Scott, we want to thank you so much for being with us, and we will cover your news conference later today. Where are you holding it?
It's at Oscar Grant Plaza in front of Oakland City Hall at 10 a.m.
Scott Olson, former Marine who served 2 tours in the Iraq War, was critically wounded after being shot not in Iraq, but shot in the head by a police projectile at Occupy Oakland. Hospitalized in critical condition with fractured skull, broken neck vertebrae, brain swelling. Member of Iraq Veterans Against the War. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Democracy Now!
For more news, visit youtube.com/pigmind5.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.tv.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host, and before the break we were discussing the Syrian situation and what was taking place over there, the recent victories of the Syrian military, as well as the attempts by Turkey to create a false flag situation and use that as a pretext to invade Syria. But now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about what's happening in Ukraine. Now, to many people, it's, again, this show's being recorded on April the 9th, so, only God knows what can happen in between April the 9th and when this show is broadcast. But essentially, to most people at this point, it may even seem as if things are quiet in Ukraine, or more quiet than they should be, but in actuality, that's not entirely the case. We all know what happened in terms of Crimea, and how Crimea had a referendum that decided that it would rather be part of Russia, and then Russia annexed the Crimean region. But we also have now as a situation blooming in Ukraine, where the eastern part of Ukraine, the eastern part of the country, is now being destabilized and leaning more toward the Russian side. We have numerous instances of pro-Russian militias taking action in the east of Ukraine. We've also got pro-Russian demonstrators who are trying to seize government buildings. They are calling for referendums. Largely, this appears that they may be trying to have referendums and be part of Russia in the Crimean mold, the Crimean example. Obviously, this is angering the Western-backed regime in Kiev, as one would expect, and there's been a lot of strong talk lately. The Interior Minister Arsen Avakov has just stated that the separatist protests in Ukraine's eastern region would either be resolved within 48 hours, either through negotiations or through the use of force. So what does that mean? We have several instances here that if moved forward with, could actually cause a combat situation between Russian forces and Ukraine forces proper, or simply another annexation, which would lead people like Skull and Bones John Kerry to propagandize and claim that Russia was acting aggressively toward Ukraine. So let's take a look at some of the things that are going on. The Russians have a pretty sizable presence of troops on the Russian side of the border between Russia and Ukraine. The United States estimates that there's up to 40,000 Russian troops on the border with eastern Ukraine. NATO is warning of a major troop buildup. U.S. Ambassador in Kiev, Jeffrey Piat. Remember, this was Piat who was on the phone with Victoria Nuland, where she says, fuck the EU, and she's talking about various ways of installing Arseniy Yatsenyuk as prime minister, which of course is what happened later on. But Jeffrey Piat is posting photos on Twitter on Wednesday, and he's illustrating the U.S. estimates. And this is supposedly a field outside the Russian city of Rostov, which was empty in October, now filled with troops and armored vehicles on April the 2nd. And CNN has, they're claiming that they looked at these photos and they're consistent with classified imagery. Well, if it's classified, why is Piat releasing these photos, right? This is the release of classified material. Is he authorized to release classified material, or did he just, or should he be Bradley Manninged, or should he be Edward Snowden? Well, Bradley Manninged. I wouldn't want him to be Edward Snowden and flown across the world and staying in fancy hotels and speaking at different conferences. But that's another topic. First of all, the claims by Arsen Avakov, the Interior Minister of Ukraine. Again, let's not forget that we know Avakov because Avakov is largely the person suspected of guilt in the killing of Mzichko of Right Sector. Mzichko, of course, the disgusting fat thug who was seen bullying the poor civil servant in the famous YouTube video, part of Right Sector, the neo-Nazi organization. But the neo-Nazi groups, the Right Sector thugs, I guess Pravi Sector, meaning Right Sector in Ukrainian, have forced Yatsenyuk to acknowledge the possible guilt of Avakov, or at least to acknowledge that there are issues with Avakov, and so that is a situation that's developing there in Kiev. It didn't take that situation very long to break down. It didn't take it long at all after the Western backed coup. But the claims that Russia has 40,000 troops on the border, at one time these estimates said 80,000. Now they say 40,000. Well, what does it matter? Russia has a right to put troops on its borders, particularly when it is faced with a government on its borders that is consistently threatening Russia with military action, with concerted NATO-based military action, with action from the West, who have been involved in promoting sanctions against Russia, and who have had former prime ministers like the gas princess Yulia Tymoshenko actually say that she wanted to nuke Russians. And I guess Russia is supposed to turn around and just turn the other cheek and ignore that this was ever said or that this ever happened. Well, I'm sorry, there's plenty of reasons. Whatever you think of Putin, whatever you think of Russia, Russia has ample reason to build up troops on the borders. It's only prudent to do so. In the discussion of protection of ethnic Russians, right, we have in the eastern Ukraine, we have what would be considered ethnic Russians. In the western part of Ukraine, it's more European, more, I guess, would maybe Germanic or Slavic, but more Russian on the east, more, I guess, European proper on the west. So, with the issue of protection of ethnic Russians, which are in danger, again, the gas princess saying that she wanted to nuke them, there is also ample reason to be concerned here. Obviously, Russia's foreign ministry is saying that Ukraine and the United States have no reason for concern about the presence of their forces, which they say are on military exercises. And of course, you have to read between the lines. Military exercises are never military exercises. Military exercises are actual preparations. Foreign Ministry of Russia says Russia has repeatedly stated that it does not conduct unusual or unplanned activities which are militarily significant on its territory near the border with Ukraine. It added the accusations that Russia was building up its armed forces were groundless. Of course, they're not groundless, but they were provoked to begin with from the West, with the people who were whining about it. So we also have pro-Russian protesters seizing government buildings in the cities of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Kharkiv on Sunday. So we have some of the protesters who occupied Donetsk's regional government building declared a people's republic, called for a referendum on secession from Ukraine or at least to be held by May the 11th. And they, as of right now, they actually maintain control of that building. We also have Kharkiv, more than 70 people being detained on Tuesday. The Ukrainian authorities are calling that an anti-terrorism operation, as they cleared the government building of protesters. The protesters are now terrorists. This is what Avakov is referring to when he says there's a 48-hour deadline that's either going to be settled by negotiation or force. Here's what Avakov has to say. There are two opposite ways for resolving this conflict: a political dialogue and the heavy-handed approach, which we are ready for both. He said this to a Ukrainian news outlet. Moscow has warned that any use of force to crack down on protesters in the region, the eastern region of Ukraine, could lead to civil war, and it called for, quote, the immediate cessation of any military preparations. Now, let me just continue here at the time that we have. There are reports that the demonstrators who took control over the government building in Luhansk, whether or not they took hostages, we simply don't know. The Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian anti-terrorism unit, is claiming that they have. Victoria Sumar, security service spokeswoman, and Yarema Du, spokeswoman or spokesman for the National Security and Defense Council, told the various news agencies that the pro-Russian demonstrators have taken people hostage. Of course, the demonstrators have said that they haven't. So it's very questionable. If the demonstrator says they haven't taken any hostages, I mean, if you took a hostage, you would think that you would try to use that hostage for leverage, and they're not trying to do that. So it doesn't look like this is really true. Now, let's see what we have here. Quotes by John Kerry. John Kerry is now claiming that Russian forces and special agents are behind the most recent chaos, as he called it, in eastern Ukraine. Kerry described what's happening in Ukraine as, quote, more than deeply disturbing, said it amounted to what could be a contrived pretext for military intervention, just as we saw in Crimea. In other words, a false flag. It's funny, Skull and Bones John Kerry is very apt. He's very understanding of what a false flag entails when it's the possibility that that false flag was instigated by Syria, when it was instigated by Libya, when it was the potentially instigated by Syria, Libya, or potentially instigated by Russia. He's very good at picking out situations that could be false flags when it pertains to those three countries. When it's his own country, it's preposterous. It's unbelievable. It's nefarious to even suggest such a thing. Well, of course, Skull and Bones Kerry would know about the false flag attack very well because, for instance, the chemical attacks in Syria were indeed false flag attacks, which were organized by the West and Saudi Arabia. So he would know about false flag attacks. He would know about the same thing in Libya because he was involved in that, and he would know about that in Ukraine because he is apparently trying to provoke a third world war with Russia over this useless, non-strategic piece of land that has ties to Russia anyway. So he's claiming that Russia could provoke a false flag for military involvement. Now, is that not the pot calling the kettle black? Is John Kerry claiming that another country may stage a false flag attack for the purposes of military intervention into a sovereign country? Is that not the pot calling the kettle black? This is absolute hypocrisy of the highest order, but what should we expect? Now, it's also, I feel that I would be remiss in my duty if I did not point out the fact that there is the possibility of Russian intelligence provoking and encouraging, I guess, what else could you call it, destabilization for the purposes of annexing further territory, marching forward in that regard, and responding to the Anglo-American version of the world oligarchy. There is that distinct possibility. Do we have any clear evidence of it? No. But I'm not as willing as some of my colleagues and fellow analysts to throw that idea out. I'm not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Governments engage in destabilization tactics. Governments engage in secret agency tactics. They engage in false flags. And this is not simply something that has happened with the United States. It's entirely possible that Putin and the KGB have, or the relevant intelligence agencies, have been involved in stirring up unrest in eastern Ukraine. But of course, eastern Ukraine, again, as I point out, has high ties to Russia. So just to bear that in mind, let's not rush into the arms. Let's not be so perturbed and so full of hatred for the Anglo-American wing of the world oligarchy that we simply run into the arms of the Russian wing of the oligarchy as well. So we also have reports from the Polish foreign minister Radoslaw Sikorski told CNN's Christian Amanpour that Russia is financing subversion in eastern Ukraine using the pretext of ethnic tensions. And he says, quote, "What's happening in Ukraine is unacceptable. A more powerful nation is first taking a province away from a less powerful country and now financing subversion using the pretext of ethnic problems which are non-existent." Well, sorry, they are existent. And the Polish foreign minister, where were you? Where were you when the United States and Britain and France and NATO in general were attempting to do that very thing in Syria and are still attempting to do it? Where are you, Sikorsky? So only in the situation with Russia, Poland is barking up the wrong tree. But I will say again, I want to stress that let's not throw this idea that the Russian government is also funding their own version of the color revolution as well. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of that. Now, I'd like to stick on Ukraine if I had the time, but I can't. I want to mention briefly Egypt. Egypt recently has arrested and condemned to death hundreds of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. This, of course, has caused stirs and howls of human rights criticisms across the world. Muslim Brotherhood, of course, is totally linked with death squad organizations, and it's basically Western intelligence. It always has been from the word go, and it is today. Now, I am 100% against the death penalty in any country. In any country across the world. I do not believe in the death penalty. I actively campaign against it. But let's bear in mind what's taking place in Egypt. Before we complain about the human rights record of Egypt in terms of these hundreds of death sentences that have been pronounced upon the Muslim Brotherhood, let us remember that there are hundreds or over 100,000 innocent Syrians who are dead on whose blood is on the hands of the Western powers. So, before we lay blame here, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Now, I don't think personally that these executions are going to take place. In Egypt, it's pretty commonplace for a person to be handed the death sentence, but the death sentence actually not be carried all the way out. That either it's commuted to prison sentence or something like that. So that's important to mention as well. Also, wish I could get into more about color revolutions. I'd encourage you to read my article, The History and Science of Color Revolutions, Part 3. That third part is now out at Activist Post. And also, please check out my article, Protest Rage in Taiwan Over China Trade Deal. What we have is a massive, let me take that back. It's not massive in the same sense that Thailand was massive, but it's a very large protest movement, which is calling itself the Sunflower Movement. And essentially, these protesters are very upset about the new China trade deal. It's another ridiculous trade deal, a free trade deal that would be signed with China, between China and Taiwan. This would open up Taiwanese markets to China and Chinese markets to Taiwan. As far as I can tell, this is only going to hurt Taiwan, as most free trade markets do, although it can have negative effects on China as well. Students are largely the tip of the spear. This protest movement. They've been taking control of government buildings. They've been protesting in various ways. This is pretty new for the Taiwanese people. This is not something that you generally see happening there. And of course, if you go to my article, you can actually see some of the students taking over the parliament buildings. Now, we don't know. Actually, as of this broadcast, I should mention that the Taiwanese protesters are now fractured themselves, because the idea was that this trade deal was going to be signed just about through executive power, not really any oversight of the parliament. Some students entirely opposed the trade deal, period, and other students opposed simply, it's not just students, by the way, but other protesters opposed the very idea of the trade deal. Others opposed the idea that the parliament was unable to oversee the signing of the trade deal. What has happened recently is that the Taiwanese government has stated that it will give greater authority to the Taiwanese parliament to oversee the trade deals, and that this trade deal would be overseen by the parliament. There would be tighter oversight. So many of the protesters have agreed to go home. as a result of this, they see this as a victory, but many other ones are saying, no, this is not a victory. We want to stop the trade deal. What is slightly unclear is that whether or not this protest is genuine. I found no evidence that it is not genuine. We've had actually more evidence showing that Taiwanese President Ma is closely related to the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, and some other NGOs like USAID and so forth, National Endowment for Democracy. There's been evidence that he has connections to these organizations and the Color Revolution destabilization network, not the protesters. But still, we have to look at these things with a clear head and not be dragged into them just in a reactionary fashion. But still, everything that I can see, none of this points to a color revolution. Right? This looks like an entirely genuine protest by the Taiwanese students. And of course, this trade deal, this should be opposed. This is more free trade. This is more outsourcing of jobs. This is more lower wages for working people, for the people who actually have jobs. This is the lowering of living standards, the globalization of the economy. So this should be opposed. President Ma is corrupt. The Taiwanese parliament, of course, is corrupt, as all parliaments and presidents are. And again, this should be opposed. So hands off at this point to the Taiwanese protesters. That until we find something that incriminates them, we're going to support the Taiwanese protesters in their opposition of the trade deal there in Taiwan. So once again, I want to encourage you to please check out my article, The History and Science of Color Revolutions and Protests Rage in Taiwan Over China Trade Deal. Actually, it looks like we have just a couple more minutes here, so I want to mention some of the things in this History and Science of Color Revolutions Part 3. If you haven't read Part 1 and 2, please go Google that, find it, and read it if you want to understand how these color revolutions actually work and who's behind them and how they're maintained. But in a sense, what I've done in this article is I went through it and tried to show the reader a case study in the art of color revolution and destabilization by using Milosevic's Serbia, what happened in Serbia, and I used a very good article by Jonathan Mowat entitled A New Gladio, which I would encourage you to pull up. Jonathan Mowat, his article is probably the best article on color revolutions and destabilizations that I know that has been written, and it can be found at Color Revolutions and Geopolitics.blogspot.com. Quite a long title there, but Color Revolutions and Geopolitics.blogspot.com. And essentially, what this article does is discusses obviously what my article discusses, the history and the science of color revolutions. It goes back and shows you some of the individuals at play, where this theory came out and how it was used throughout the years, both in Ukraine and Serbia and in other Eastern European nations. And unfortunately, it seems to be very effective in Eastern Europe. It's been used many times, but of course we don't have the time to go into this article in depth. But maybe next week. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. Again, go check those articles out. Stay vigilant on the foreign policy and the domestic fronts. Stay vigilant on all of these fronts. And I want to remind you that you can catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. UCY.TV, UCY.TV/TT for Truth on the Tracks if you want to find the show's personal page. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.